The day usually starts really early, before the sun is even fully up. Out in the tea gardens in South Asia, you'll find women already at work, moving through the rows, picking leaves quickly, one after another. It's just part of the daily routine, and the whole place feels alive in its own quiet way. At the same time, if you look far away from those fields, like in supermarkets or in ads, you'll see a very different picture. There, fair trade is presented as something positive, almost like a guarantee that things are fair and workers are being treated right. But that raises a question. What if the people actually doing the work don't really feel that sense of fairness? What if fair trade, instead of changing things, just becomes another part of how the plantations keep running, keeping wages low, production high, and workers thinking that any small benefit only comes from them working even harder? That's what this video is trying to explore. We're going into tea estates in India and Sri Lanka to look at how fair trade became part of everyday life there, how the system was set up, how workers see it, and why something that's supposed to make trade more ethical can sometimes end up keeping the same old inequalities in place. If you look at tea plantations in South Asia, they didn't just appear as ordinary farms. They were set up during colonial times, mainly to serve export markets. The whole system was designed in a way that kept labor cheap, while most of the profits moved upward. To make that work, plantation owners depended heavily on migrant and marginalized workers. These workers were often divided along lines like caste, ethnicity, gender, and class, which made it easier to control them and much harder for them to push back. That history still shapes things today, especially in places like India and Sri Lanka. Tea is still grown in those same regions, and life on the plantations hasn't changed as much as you might expect. Workers often live and work within these estates, almost cut off from other opportunities. Women usually handle the plucking, while men tend to have the factory jobs or supervisory roles. And because many workers face poverty and social exclusion, they don't have much bargaining power or real options outside the plantations. So when fair trade came in during the 1990s, it stepped into this already complicated situation. The idea was to improve conditions not just for small farmers, but also for plantation workers, making sure they had better wages, rights, and some level of social protection. On paper, it sounded like a big step forward. But in reality, as our study shows, things turned out to be a lot more complicated than expected. When people talk about fair trade on plantations, it's not just about sticking a label on tea. There's actually a whole system behind it. There are rules about how workers should be treated, extra money called the premium, and a group called the Fairtrade Premium Committee that's supposed to decide how that money gets used to support workers, their families, and the wider community. At least in theory, it's all meant to make sure workers have rights, decent conditions, and a real say in what happens. On paper, it sounds pretty straightforward. You've got production on one side and fairness on the other, neatly separated. But when you look at what's really happening on the ground, it's not that clear-cut. Management often ends up influencing how people understand the premium, how it's spent, and even who gets a voice in those decisions. And that's important because the premium isn't just extra cash. It shapes how people think about what fair trade actually stands for, who deserves to benefit, and what kind of behavior gets rewarded. What stood out most in our study is a bit concerning. Many workers don't see fair trade as proof that their employer is meeting labor standards. Instead, they tend to see it as a kind of reward for producing good quality tea or working hard. And that misunderstanding isn't just a small mix-up. It's part of how the system works in everyday life. In a way, it turns fair trade into something that encourages workers to put in more effort, often in line with what management wants. When workers talked about fair trade, they didn't describe it in big, abstract terms. They kept it simple and practical. They talked about things they could actually see and feel, like extra money from the premium, small loans, bonuses, cleaner workplaces, help with school fees, and better access to healthcare. For many of them, fair trade wasn't really about rights or rules. It just felt like support, like something that made life a bit easier when wages were still low. Some workers explained it in a very straightforward way. If the estate works harder, the premium increases. And when that premium increases, more benefits show up. That way of thinking kind of turns the usual story upside down. Instead of seeing fair trade as something that holds management accountable, workers start to feel like it's their own effort that brings the rewards. That shift really matters. It means people don't experience certification as outside monitoring or pressure. Instead, it becomes part of how work is understood day to day. Basically, work more, get more, and the whole estate does better. And that's where things get interesting from a political economy point of view. Fair trade stops being just a label about doing the right thing. It becomes part of how work is organized, how people make sense of it, and even how they're encouraged to behave on the job. Now the story shifts from policies on paper to what actually happens in people's daily lives. What we found is that these loans and welfare projects funded by premiums often end up making workers more dependent on estate management. That's because management usually has a say in things like deductions, approvals, and how projects are carried out. So it starts to get unclear where worker representation ends and management control begins. In some estates, workers were pretty open about it. They said committee meetings mostly focused on how much premium money had come in and what to spend it on, not really on workers' rights. Over time, fair trade starts to feel less about fairness and justice, and more about small benefits and assistance. And that matters, because it quietly reinforces the idea that the plantation system will stay the way it is, just a bit more humane. We also notice that this plays out differently for women and men. Women often end up with much longer days, since they are juggling plantation work along with responsibilities at home. That leaves them with less time or energy to look for other income or push back against the system. Men, on the other hand, are sometimes able to take advantage of things like attendance bonuses or incentives. That can help them earn a bit more, and in some cases, it even lines their interests up more closely with management's focus on keeping workers showing up consistently. This is the point where things start to shift a bit in the documentary. Fair trade was meant to fix the imbalance, to make things fairer for workers. But in a lot of cases, it doesn't really change the system. It kind of helps keep it going. What we're saying in this video is that the way plantations are set up really matters. There's already a structure there. Class differences, caste issues, ethnic divisions, and a strong male-dominated system. all of that shapes how fair trade actually works on the ground and what it ends up doing. There's this idea from Burawoy called manufacturing consent, and it helps explain what's going on. It's not that workers are being fooled or tricked. It's more that the way the workplace is organized makes management's goals feel normal, even reasonable, like everyone's on the same page, when in reality the power balance hasn't really changed. On tea plantations, this shows up in things like bonuses, training programs, small benefits from Fairtrade premiums, and this constant message that higher productivity is good for everyone. Over time, it starts to feel like common sense. And that's really the tension at the center of the story. Fairtrade talks about fairness and justice, but on the plantation, it often gets folded into this push for higher output. So it's not exactly a simple case of deception. It's something more complicated and harder to challenge. It's a system that can take something meant to be fair and still use it to keep the same patterns going. Why does this happen? Honestly, it's because the benefits, even if they're small, still matter. In low-paying plantation jobs, getting a loan, a bonus, some safety training, or even small welfare improvements can make a real difference in people's lives. So from a worker's point of view, it's not nothing. It actually helps. And that's what gives the whole system some credibility. It also makes it harder to criticize because people aren't choosing between some clear idea of fair versus unfair. They're just trying to get by with what's available. There's also another side to it. It's not just about the benefits themselves, but how they're explained. Workers are often told what those benefits represent. If management or committees keep saying things like, "This comes from working harder," over and over, people can start to believe that connection. So they begin to link their extra effort directly to whatever label is on the tea. That's why this video matters. It shows that political economy isn't only about numbers like prices or trade. It's also about how people make sense of things at work, how meaning is shaped, how behavior is guided, and how, over time, people come to accept the system they're part of.
By now, you can probably see the bigger picture. Food and farming aren't just about what gets grown. It's also about who ends up paying the price, who makes the money, and who gets to shape the story about what's fair. If you're getting something out of this, make sure you've hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. We're breaking down the politics behind food and agriculture in a way that's easy to follow. In the next part, we're going to look beyond how fair trade is talked about and dig into the tougher question. What does it actually change for workers, and what does it leave the same? Training is another important part of how the system works. In our study, we noticed that when workers are trained on safety or cleanliness, it's often explained in a way that connects their well-being to how productive they are and how much money the company can save. On the surface, that sounds like a good thing, and it is to a point. But it also quietly sends the message that improving workers' conditions matters because it helps the estate run more efficiently. That difference might seem small, but it actually matters. For example, a safety training can genuinely help reduce injuries, which is great. But at the same time, it can also double as a way to keep workers more productive. The same goes for cleanliness campaigns. They can make the workplace healthier, but they're also tied to producing more and improving the quality of the tea for the company. So in the end, worker welfare and business goals get blended together. That's why in this video, fair trade is described as offering tools for managing labor, not just support for workers. Those tools can help estate managers keep things running smoothly, like reducing absenteeism and guiding worker behavior, in ways that also help keep the plantation profitable. The downsides are pretty serious when you look closely. For one, certification can make things look better than they really are. It tends to highlight small improvements, which can distract from the bigger issue. People are still earning poverty-level wages. Then there's the way the extra money, or premium, is handled. In some cases, it actually makes workers more dependent on management, especially if things like loans or deductions are controlled by the estate. Instead of giving workers more freedom, it can tie them even closer to the system they're already stuck in. Another problem is how this setup can quietly shift how workers think about their rights. Instead of seeing fair pay and decent conditions as basic rights, it can start to feel like they should just be grateful for whatever extra benefits they get. That takes away from holding employers accountable. There's also a gender side to this that often gets overlooked. Women are usually doing more unpaid work at home on top of their jobs, so they end up working longer hours overall. That makes it harder for them to take advantage of incentive programs or to get involved in workplace decisions. At the same time, the push for higher productivity can mean more pressure to produce without actually improving people's living conditions. And maybe the biggest issue is this. The idea of fairness that comes with certification can end up fitting neatly into the same system focused on making profits. So at one end, people feel better buying the product, thinking it's ethical. But at the other end, the workers are still getting by with very little, just in a slightly more managed way. This video isn't saying fair trade doesn't make any difference. What it's saying is that the changes it brings are a bit mixed and sometimes don't go in the same direction. Some workers do benefit from the extra money or support that comes from Fairtrade premiums. In some places, that can mean better safety measures, small improvements in welfare, or occasional bonuses that help with everyday life. But those improvements don't always lead to bigger changes like higher wages, stronger bargaining power, or more say in how things are run. The problem the video points out is that fair trade can end up working inside the same system it's trying to fix. Plantations are often already set up in a way that can absorb small reforms and turn them into things that mainly help productivity rather than shift power. So the argument is that fair trade, as it currently works, often fits within what management is willing to allow instead of really changing who holds control. So the real question isn't whether fair trade is there or not. It clearly is. The question is who actually benefits most from it once it's running inside the plantation system. The main takeaway from this story is that just having a label doesn't automatically mean people are truly free or better off. On tea plantations, fair trade can bring some clear, visible improvements. But at the same time, it can also end up being a way to get workers to accept the system as it is, deal with limited resources, and push productivity even when conditions aren't equal. That's the tension at the heart of ethical trade. The bigger question isn't really whether the tea is certified or not. It's whether workers actually have real control over their wages, their working conditions, how they're represented, and the value they help produce. Without that kind of control, certification can end up just being a nice-sounding label placed over a system that still takes more from workers than it gives back. And that's what the next video will look at. Moving past the label, past the promises, and digging deeper into how food and agriculture actually work in practice. So basically, in many South Asian tea plantations, fair trade isn't really felt by workers as a strong system for protecting their rights. Instead, it often feels more like a reward you get if the estate is doing well and you've been productive. A lot of the time, it's the estate management that decides how the Fairtrade Premium money is understood and spent, which means workers don't always have much say in it. There are also loans, bonuses, and training programs, but these can end up making workers more dependent on the estate. In some cases, it even lines them up more with management's interests rather than giving them independence. For women workers, things are even harder because they're not just doing plantation work. They still have to handle most of the housework and deal with social expectations at home too, so the pressure really adds up. Fair trade certification does improve some living and working conditions, but it doesn't really change the fact that wages stay low or that power is still very uneven between workers and management. And in the end, ethical labels like fair trade can kind of get absorbed into the existing system without changing much, unless workers actually have real bargaining power. Anyway, watch out for the next video where we go into the political economy of food and agriculture. You can also check out other videos on the channel. And feel free to comment. What part of this changed how you think about fair trade and tea?